the recording starts. Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our Totem Top 10 series. This is our series on basic cybersecurity hygiene and specifically the 10 cybersecurity safeguards that we recommend that you implement in order to lower your cybersecurity risk. And today we are talking about two controls as we did last week. We're going to be discussing backing up your data and testing restoration and enabling multi-factor authentication. These are our 8th and 9th, respectively, controls in our Totem Top 10. So we are quickly moving this thing along. I want to give a huge thanks, of course, to Ohio SBDC and Youngstown State for allowing us, Totem Technologies, the opportunity to come in and present this series. We've had an awesome time so far. We've covered a lot of different things, a very diverse range of controls. And hopefully you're starting to see how these controls fit into your business, how they are indeed helpful to you and not just a burden, and really how simple they are to implement and inexpensive as well. And so we hope to continue that trend today as we look at these two new controls. I do want to remind you before we get going that if you have not had the opportunity to participate in every session, we do record these and then put them up on YouTube. And when I say we, I mean Ohio SBDC. They are recording these, so if you want to find the links to those recordings, just let them know and they'd be happy to provide those for you. And if you have never seen me before, if this is your first time joining us, obviously welcome. It's good to have you. My name is Nathan, and I am a cybersecurity engineer with Totem Technologies. And I've had an awesome time doing this. This is session 7, but this will be our 8th time meeting as we had a session 0, sort of lay the groundwork for this series. And I've had an awesome time doing this, and I've enjoyed just talking fun nerd stuff with you guys. I really enjoy this. So if you have any questions, maybe after the series is over or in between sessions, feel free to get in touch with me. All my contact information is there on the screen. Well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and transition into our topics for today. As I mentioned, these are the two controls we're going to be addressing. And we're going to start by talking about data backups and specifically how these are of use to you and your business in helping protect you from catastrophe, from when something inevitably goes wrong, and how these data backups will serve as your key to being able to recover quickly from the event of an incident or an unplanned event. And so we will take a look at different strategies for data backups, different implications for these data backups, and how you and your organization can immediately hit the ground running and start thinking through what sort of data backup strategy you need to be building. Specifically, we'll be looking at data recovery metrics, and namely the pieces that go into building a data recovery strategy. And so we'll identify all of that. The second half of this session is we're going to discuss multi-factor authentication, and specifically how this incredibly powerful technology can be used essentially to protect yourself, to protect your business from something, from an attack, say, targeting credentials. And so multi-factor authentication can add an incredibly powerful layer of defense to protect yourself in the event of, say, someone uses a weak password. And so we'll look at everything having to do with multi-factor authentication as well. Tools for today, as always, we refer to our system inventory template, which you can find on our free tools page. I'll grab the link for you for that. We have on our website, it's like this. This is our free tools page. The link, this is where I have been referring you all this entire time. We have lots of different free resources to choose from that you can come and download whenever you like. And all these different resources serve a wide variety of different purposes. But for this series, we have relied heavily on our system inventory template here for a number of different purposes. And so we will, as we've done every week, be referring to that today. So feel free to check out that resource and see if there are any other on here you may like as well. Quick review before we jump in, as we do every single week. We have discussed extensively why small businesses are prime targets for hackers. We have identified that small businesses are way too overconfident in their cybersecurity. They tend to believe that as a whole, they are more secure than they actually are, even though they are typically relying on perhaps old habits or maybe even old technology for their standard business operations. And so this is not good. Additionally, we've identified that users, system users of small businesses, those who are regularly handling your company's sensitive information, are typically not trained to be able to identify and prevent cyber threats that pose a significant risk to your organization, such as phishing. Okay, so our users aren't trained. Additionally, because we are relying on old or outdated technology, this means that the IT system assets that are facilitating the sensitive information that lives within our environment, those tend to not be secure. And so as a whole, we are opening the door to adversaries easily attacking us and making off with our sensitive information and doing significant damage to us as a result. There is a myth that we've debunked over and over again that hackers don't seem to care about small businesses. We've seen that this just is not the case. In fact, we're seeing a disturbing trend in recent years that hackers actually care more about small businesses now than they ever have before. And it's because of these weaknesses, because of these deficiencies that I've identified that make us prime targets for hackers. We are easy to pick off. So we need to do something about this. We need to have a plan. And our approach to this is what we would call a layered defense in depth approach to our cybersecurity, meaning that instead of having one or two really effective safeguards, or maybe going out and hiring a full-time, cybersecurity staff, which we probably don't have the budget to do, we instead are going to layer multiple different safeguards together, different cybersecurity controls together. And with those working together, in the event that an adversary does attempt to attack us, we are more likely to resist that attack, as if one of our safeguards does not work in preventing that attack, another one can step in and take its place. And so we rely heavily on this defense in depth approach to our cybersecurity, and we rely on many different controls working together to lower our risk. And our approach to defense in depth is the Totem Top 10 in terms of basic cybersecurity hygiene. This is why we are doing this series, to sort of give you some examples, some things to think about of different defense in depth strategies. We would identify these 10 controls as the most important, or perhaps the ones you should implement first. They are certainly not the only controls you should be implementing, but they're a great place to start. To serve as sort of our baseline and a measuring point throughout this series, during session 0, our first meeting of the series, we took a look at an actual phishing email that we received a few years back. And we looked at, okay, what would this phishing email have done if a user had clicked on it and we did not have any safeguards in place? And we saw that the end result with a user clicking on that invoice.doc attachment there is embedded deep within that Word document was some malicious code. And essentially that malicious code would trigger when the user clicked on the document, which would then reach out to an external file server hosted in the cloud, and it would pull back a malicious file. That file would run and then proceed to install what's known as a keylogger, essentially a piece of technology that would monitor and forward everything that you're typing on your keyboard to an external destination, to a hacker who will then harvest that information for their malicious purposes. And so this phishing email has served as sort of our reference point throughout the series. When we look at a new control, we're like, okay, what would this have done to prevent, what would this control have done to prevent that phishing email from being successful? Or if not prevent it, what would it have done to lower the risk of that phishing email from being successful? And so we've seen 6-7 weeks in now that there are a lot of different ways to prevent something like this from being successful. So imagine what would happen if we had multiple safeguards working together to prevent something like this from being successful. Well, we're sitting in a pretty good spot, I would think. And so last week we discussed 2 different controls that we would look to add to our defense in depth strategy. We talked about system hardening and how taking a given system from its perhaps default or current vulnerable state and looking for ways to secure it, such as disabling, unsecure services or encryption methods running on that system, disabling those, disabling default credentials and setting new credentials. There are lots of different ways to harden a system. And so if you have not, if you were not in the discussion last week, I encourage you to go check out that recording. We attempted to harden an actual router, but the live demonstration gods were not favorable to us. And so we didn't get very far into that. But I explained a lot about system hardening in that session last week, so go check that out. Additionally, we looked at network segmentation and how many small businesses are operating what is known as flat networks, meaning that all devices within that network can easily communicate with all other devices. So your computer can talk to your printer, which can talk to your file server, which can talk to your CEO's iPad, et cetera, et cetera. And this obviously is not what we want, because that means an adversary could just target the weakest link there, probably the printer or the iPad or something. And once they've successfully exploited that device, they can pretty much move around that network with impunity wherever they want and find whatever they're looking for. And so one way that we can take action in preventing this from happening is we can chop up our network into different pieces, logically segment them into different isolated pieces as a means of making it more difficult for an adversary to move around and find what they're looking for if they were to successfully exploit a given device. Hopefully we've hardened that device to the point where the adversary would just give up after trying to exploit it because they wouldn't be successful in doing so. But in the event that does happen, we can use network segmentation to keep an adversary from moving laterally through your network, from moving up to find what they're ultimately after. And keep in mind that this control goes really well with our 10th control, which we will discuss next week, which is to collect and analyze event logs. You should be monitoring your network if network segmentation is truly going to work. And so we'll discuss more about that next week. But that's what we've discussed up to this point. And this is where we stand so far in our series. We are moving along quite well, I think. Please note that next week is going to be our last session of the series. Today, we will cover the 8th and 9th control, and then next week we will wrap up with our 10th and final control of the series, and then we will do sort of a big overview of everything that we have discussed. We'll talk about lessons learned, we'll talk about where to go from here, and we will, I guess, set you guys off on your way to implementing these controls and getting your cybersecurity program off the ground. And so would encourage you to come back and participate next week if you have the opportunity to do so, as we look to wrap up what has been a really fun series. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our session for today. And we'll start with a conversation on backing up your data. So on its simplest level, a data backup is simply a copy of some computer information and essentially storing that in another location, likely because or in case of an unplanned event. So something goes wrong, we have this copy of our information so that we don't lose it, right? Now, hopefully you already know the benefits of having this, but something to keep in mind is that when it comes to like worst case scenarios or unplanned events rather, it really is a matter of when and not if. That's why I italicized when on the slide here. An unplanned event is going to occur within your organization. We need to operate under this assumption. If something has not already gone wrong within your organization and information was lost, it likely will happen. And so we need to have a plan in place. We need to have a plan to protect us from these unplanned events, from these potentially worst case scenarios occurring. And so there are a number of different unplanned events that could occur that I mentioned. For example, we could get hit with a ransomware attack. An adversary could compromise, infiltrate our systems, and then effectively encrypt all of our information and demand a ransom in return for decrypting that information. And whether or not that decryptor actually works, rarely does it ever actually work, we are in a really tough spot. And essentially we are at the mercy of the adversaries. And so in this case, a data backup would allow us to, I'm not going to say not have to worry about the ransomware, but it gives us the opportunity to just restore our information, right? It's not, the ransomware is not as effective if we have backups, if we have copies of our information. And I say not always because ransomware is a continually evolving attack. We are seeing adversaries use other ways, go about other ways to exploit us, to get money out of us, such as threatening to make public our information that they get a hold of. And so there are other ways that we are seeing attackers get money out of us, unfortunately. But a data backup will allow us to not lose the information in the end, should something such as a ransomware attack occur. And that's sort of the hot topic now when it comes to cybersecurity. So I gotta watch out for ransomware. I gotta be on guard for ransomware. And ransomware is only one of the things you should be on the lookout for and be preparing for, but data backups go a long way to protecting you in the event that something does go wrong. Additionally, your organization may encounter a hardware or software failure. Perhaps your file server that you stored everything on, it dies and you're not able to extract any of the information off of it. Well, in this event, a data backup would be helpful, right? So that information isn't gone forever. Software failure. I am a little ashamed telling this story, but only a couple months after I started working with Totem Tech, I had the opportunity to do some work on our website. And long story short, I ended up bringing down the website. And if it were not for a backup that we had of the website, it would have been a lot more pain and misery getting the website back online. So I'm very thankful that we had a backup that we could easily restore, because it was an unplanned event. I didn't see it coming, but we had that there ready for us. Additionally, data corruption. Something happens to Adam. All of us are thankful for the backup. Yes, me especially. That was an interesting day. Data corruption. The data may get corrupted in one way or another. There are lots of different ways that data can get corrupted. If that were to happen, it's nice to have a backup. User error. What if someone is, say you have a database technician or something, someone working on the back end of your organization, and they accidentally, delete an entire table of customer names and IDs and information. It would be useful to have a backup of that to be able to restore. And finally, perhaps least likely, but most devastating would be something like a natural disaster event. I personally think that we should plan for this and be ready in case something like this does happen, within reason, of course. When it comes to our IT system assets specifically, we should have the data backups. We should have data backups that extend across our infrastructure, to really be able to step in and replace anything we might lose during a natural disaster. And so, I mean, these events are less likely, but they do happen. And so we should be prepared for them. Now, thinking back to the phishing email, the keylogger phishing attempt that we discussed in session 0, that a user clicking on that and that keylogger being installed would be an unplanned event. It would be considered an incident, and we need to take action addressing that. If that Hawkeye keylogger successfully made its way into our system, if we had backups in place, I mean, we could just wipe the system, wipe the infected system, scan everything to make sure it didn't spread anywhere else. If it did, wipe those systems too, and then just restore from backup. Assuming that we've checked also that the backups themselves have not been infected, then it makes it pretty easy to recover. And so lots of different benefits of data backups, lots of different uses for them. And they aren't typically difficult to implement or expensive, but there are different things that you need to consider when it comes to building your data backup strategy. So that's what we'll take a look at now. You have different options to consider. You can either choose to back up everything locally, meaning back up everything on site onto a specific piece of hardware that you own and that you manage. Or you can go store it all up into the cloud. You can utilize a cloud backup provider I've listed a couple on the screen here. There are lots of them. And we'll discuss some considerations for these in a minute here, but I want to start with the local. You have a few different options, and I've listed a few here. These aren't all of them, but some of the most popular, especially among small businesses. We're specifically looking at these through the small business lens. We are a small business, so a micro business actually. So many of these considerations are tools, techniques, processes that we have implemented throughout the series. I've shared some of our pains and what we've learned, what not to do, but I've also shared some of the things that have helped us for you to consider as well. But anyways, one type of local backup that you might consider would be something like a network attached storage device, or also known as a NAS. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It is a storage device that is attached to your network. And this means that devices within your network that you permit to do so, assuming we have the adequate network segmentation and administration processes in place, the devices on your network that you permit to access this NAS can retrieve or back up whatever information they want to from this device. And although these NASs weren't specifically designed to serve as a primary backup mechanism, they are advantageous, especially for small businesses, because they are pretty simple to operate compared to something like a storage area network or a SAN, which may be more complicated for a small business with no dedicated IT staff. I mean, your MSP can certainly set one up for you, but in terms of cost, management, everything, a NAS is a potential solution for you, especially if you have like 20 or fewer employees or something like that. And super helpful device. It's not overkill, essentially. Additionally, you can consider something like a good old-fashioned USB or maybe an external hard drive. These are cheap. They are nice in that you can air gap them, meaning they're not going to be attached to your network. So in the event of like a ransomware attack, we would be concerned about our NAS because it is attached to our network, right? You wouldn't have that concern probably if your USBs and your external hard drives are not physically connected to any device. If you back up your information to those, immediately disconnect them, and then store them in a locked closet or something, that is an advantage to them. A disadvantage to these, though, in my mind, at least what would be the biggest concern for me, especially with the USBs, is I might lose them. And I have lost USBs before. And what do I do when that happens? If that's, if all my information is backed up to that USB, then I'm out of luck. Additionally, these are more limited in what you can store. So if you're trying to back up terabytes worth of information, don't use a USB. Look at an external hard drive or something else, something that can store more information. And one other point back to the NAS real quick is that if you choose to implement a storage solution, a local storage solution such as a NAS, again, because it is connected to your network, this means that it is going to have to go through the same security processes that we would need to put in place for other devices, our workstations, our servers, etc. Meaning that storage device needs to be hardened. We need to identify potential attack vectors within that NAS, and we need to remediate those. Additionally, since we've segmented our network, we need to ensure that our network attached storage is where it should be. and that it is not within easy reach of an adversary if they were to successfully infiltrate your systems. So they need to be, the hardware, especially if they're network attached, need to be hardened, segmented, etc. And they need to be maintained. So some pros and cons to local. Definitely something for you to consider as a small business. But on the other hand, you may consider the cloud backup approach. And this solution is no doubt going to take some work off of your shoulders. But the downside to this is that it is going to cost you. You will pay likely a monthly fee for a cloud backup vendor to essentially store and protect your files for you. This, of course, and this is the biggest assumption here, is that you assume that you trust that vendor to do these things for you. You trust that vendor to secure, to adequately store that information for you. And this is a big assumption, right? And it may take a while to find someone that you trust to do this. Additionally, if you operate within a regulated environment, like if you are a DoD contractor in our instance, we have specific requirements that dictate how or in what manner we are to store sensitive, specific types of sensitive information, in our case, controlled unclassified information, CUI. We have strict requirements for how we're to do this. So we can't store CUI in the cloud using a cloud backup vendor that does not have the encryption methods that meet those requirements. And so we have to be very picky in who we choose. We not only have to find someone who we trust, we have to make sure that they have the adequate technology to do so. And so this can add some additional burden to your search. But on the bright side, there are some perks to cloud backups as well. Migrating to the cloud means that the hardware on your network no longer is a thing, because you're storing it, it's being stored in the cloud. It's not being stored on your local network. So this means less hardware for you to maintain and for you to secure, which is definitely a good thing. It's less hardware for you to have to harden, for you to have to fit into your segmented network. And so this definitely reduces your IT administrator's worry, I would think, and that it essentially shifts the responsibilities from you to that cloud vendor. Again, a huge responsibility now falling upon that vendor's shoulders. And we need to ensure that we trust them to take on this task. But that's one perk to utilizing cloud backup storage. Additionally, cloud storage is more scalable because you have the option to add more storage, essentially whenever you need it. You just need to pay more. You need to pay that cloud vendor more money on a monthly basis, and they'll give you access to more storage. If you used a USB or an external hard drive, those are capped at a specific limit for what you can store on it. So once you fill it up, you got to go purchase another one. So it can get a bit inconvenient having to run to the store or order one online. You can just tell your vendor, hey, we want to purchase another terabyte, for example, of storage. Additionally, automatic backups are easier. They're not, you can still back up automatically with on-site, with local backups, but the cloud vendor will take on this responsibility for you, so you don't have to worry about it. That's certainly a nice feature when it comes to cloud backups. I also mentioned security. This assumes a lot. Again, this assumes a lot about the vendor, but if you are a small business worried that you don't have the capabilities to harden your system components, to segment your network, well, then this would be one thing to consider, to sort of shift the security responsibilities to a trusted vendor who has proven that they can adequately maintain the security of your sensitive information. So either option you choose, whether you choose local or you choose cloud, there will be some downsides that you'll have to try and mitigate, that you'll have to work through. And despite this, I personally think that the future is definitely cloud if we're not already there. But unfortunately, us small businesses tend to get kicked to the curb. This option is not always affordable for us, or at least it hasn't. It's becoming more affordable, I think, for us, but it's still expensive. And so there are other options for us to consider, which is why I'm presenting this to you. Final consideration with data backups as a whole. And this is absolutely crucial. Whenever you back something up, you must test that you can actually restore that information. In fact, an alarmingly large amount of data backups actually fail when attempting to do this. And so we must, as soon as we backed up our information, we need to essentially test that we can restore that information to whatever we're trying to restore it to, that we can ensure that it actually works. And I've only talked about this very briefly, but this part of data backups really, it makes up half of this entire control. We're backing up data and testing the restoration. We do not want to be caught in an incident. Something happens, we get hit with ransomware, all our systems are infected, all of our files are encrypted, we can't get into anything. We realize, oh, we have a data backup, we go try to restore that, and for some reason the data backup fails and we're not able to restore any of our information. So we must ensure that our data backups actually work, that they can actually be restored. And so definitely keep that in mind when you are backing up your information. If you are utilizing a cloud vendor, keep this in mind, especially as you do business with them. But testing the restoration of your data backups, again, makes up half of this entire control. So it's not something to just slide under the rug. So hopefully you are starting to see the use of data backups. You're starting to picture in your mind how this would fit within your organization. However, your data backup strategy is meant to be based on what you have laid out in a document that is known as your incident response plan. This is essentially going to be the document that lays out in specific detail what your organization will do in the event of an incident, in the case of an unplanned event. It is going to identify what you will do during each, what we call phase of incident response. And there are, it depends where you look, but typically there are 6 phases of incident response. I believe NIST has 6. And your organization needs an incident response capability. Because like I said, when it comes to incidents, it's a matter of when, not if. So if you've never heard of an incident response plan, I highly recommend that you go read our blog on the topic and grab a copy of our incident response plan template. That is also on our free tools page. Right here, our incident response plan template. And then our blogs. Up here, we've written lots on incident response. So in fact, you can just search incident response incident response plan. 6 steps to include in your incident response plan, create a custom incident response plan. We talk lots. Adam says, correct, 6 phases of incident response. Yeah, I believe it's the pick-a-roll model that is used by NIST, PICERL, each letter indicating a different step within incident response. These are laid out in the incident response plan, which I have here. This is what the template looks like. It is an extensive document. It's about 34 pages. But this template is where you are going to identify everything when it comes to how your organization will handle responding to an incident. Specifically, how your organization will handle backing up your data. And so go grab a copy of this template. If you need some help interpreting it, let us know. We can set up a meeting and walk you through it. But another helpful resource for you. So in this document, you will see that you're going to need to identify your organization's recovery metrics. And these are going to tell you specifically what your organization can withstand in terms of data loss, and also, I guess, what your expectations should be for backing up your data. And so there are 3 specific controls that we want to be sure to identify. First is mean tolerable downtime, or MTD. And this is essentially asking, okay, how long can our organization handle a given IT system being down before we begin to suffer intolerable consequences? Okay, so how long can we handle our file server being down before our business cannot recover? That would be an example of mean tolerable downtime. Next, we want to identify our recovery time objective, RTO. With this, we want to see how long will it take our organization to recover or to restore that given IT system to its previous capacity, or to the point that we can continue standard business operations. So how long will it take us to do this before, again, we start to suffer those intolerable consequences, before our business just cannot recover? And third and lastly is our recovery points objective, RPO. And this essentially is how much data can our organization afford to lose? Or how much data should we have backed up before the incident occurred in order to, again, avoid those intolerable consequences? And when it comes to RPO, you'll typically see this given as a measure of time. So for example, should we have backed up 1 day's worth of data? Should we have backed up 1 week's worth of data? How much can we tolerate to lose? And the handy equation that I've listed here on the screen to calculate, if you're a math guy like I am, to find the mean tolerable downtime, you can just add the recovery time objective plus the amount of time it takes to restore your RPO. Again, like I said, we give the recovery point objective typically in terms of time, so we get some consistent units here and we can do some easy math. So these are the metrics that you're going to be identifying right off the bat when you work your way through your incident response plan. But if you're like me, these metrics are confusing to understand at first. So I want to run through just a super quick analogy to hopefully help make some more sense of these. I like to camp. So let's say that one day I venture out into the high Uintas near where I live out here in Utah. I venture out into the Uintas on a camping trip and I'm by myself. I pitch my tent, I go to sleep, and I have a relaxing night of sleep. I wake up the next morning and I go outside my tent and I find that my drinking water somehow got tipped over during the night and all of it has spilled out. So I have no water and I'm in the middle of the woods. Well, this would be an example of an incident. An incident has occurred and now I need to respond or else bad things will happen. So I need to find water quickly. Now, in theory, the human body can survive up to, I think it's 3 days without water. But realistically, I would say just for this story, to maintain good health, I'm going to need to drink 1 liter of water every 12 hours. So that means that my mean tolerable downtime would be 12 hours, because that is how long I can go without water before I start to not feel so good. This means that the recovery point objective, the RPO, would be 1 liter of water. Since this is how much water I can afford to lose, up to 1 liter, but no more, until I start to reel from the effects. So I venture out and I quickly find a stream nearby. And I head down to the stream to gather some water. However, I have, not me personally, I wish I did, but theoretical Nathan here has an understanding of biology and the chemicals in those water, in the water. And so I'm not just going to drink it straight from the stream. I want to take some time to prepare the water. So, like any good experienced camper, I'm going to build a fire and I'm going to attempt to boil that water. We'll say it takes me 1 hour to boil that 1 liter of water. Again, my RPO. So describing the RPO in terms of time, it means we would describe it with one hour to restore the 1 liter of water, right? So back to our equation. If we are trying to fit all of this into our equation, our mean tolerable downtime is 12, right? That's what we said. That's how long I can go without water before I start to reel from the effects. And my RPO is 1, again, 1 hour to boil the liter of water. And so we'll say, if we're trying to calculate the RTO, we'll move RPO to the other side of the equation. So we'll have mean tolerable downtime, which is 12, minus 1, our RPO, which means that our recovery time objective is 11. So again, our recovery time objective, meaning how long will it take you to, or maybe how long do you have to restore or recover that given asset until you start to suffer intolerable consequences. So doing this quick and easy math, we see that we can tolerate up to 11 hours to fix our system and start boiling this water to get back on track. And if I were an inexperienced camper, never built a fire before, 11 hours may be just what I need. But if you are an experienced camper and you have built a fire before, and it's going to take you that long to start a fire and start boiling that water, you probably are in need of some other help. But silly example, I know, but these metrics you should be familiar with because they are keys to building your data recovery strategy. And you should be able to identify these. So grab a copy of our incident response plan, sit down, walk through these. Feel free to refer to my silly example if you need some guidance on what the metrics mean. And that is essentially data recovery, data backups as a whole. See, we've got about 10 minutes left, and so I'm going to transition here to our next control. But this is a quick run through of backing up your data and testing restoration. So as I transition to our next control, are there any questions? Any questions? I promise I can start a fire in under 11 hours. I assure you. All right. Well, let's transition. Let's enter a discussion on multi-factor authentication. And you may have heard, so multi-factor authentication, also being known as MFA. You may have heard this referred to as two-step verification, or maybe two-factor authentication. These are synonymous with one another, although multi-factor authentication certainly doesn't just limit it to two, or the other two imply that it is two verification steps. This is, without a doubt, one of the most effective technologies in our Totem Top 10, and one that we strongly advocate for everyone. And that's because this has quickly become a necessity for all organizations of all sizes. It is becoming way too easy for adversaries to crack a password, that we need an additional layer of authentication security in place to prevent adversaries from doing this. I found an interesting statistic on Microsoft's website. They estimated that multi-factor authentication can prevent upwards of 99.9% of account-based attacks. So that's a lot. That's quite effective in terms of when it comes to risk management and mitigating risk. Like that's a winner right there, in my opinion. But what does this mean? This means that, you know, an adversary may exploit, they may trick one of your users into giving them their username and password. But without a given MFA token, such as what we'll describe here in a sec, they won't be able to go anywhere. They won't be able to do anything because they still will not meet that authentication factor. So what is MFA? Well, multi-factor authentication essentially requires you to present two or more, doesn't have to just be two, but usually it is, authentication factors. And there are different types of authentication factors, different groups of these. First would be something you know. This is also known as a knowledge factor. So something that you can forget. That's an easy way to help me remember what a knowledge factor is, like a password, a PIN, an answer to a security question. Additionally, I could have an authentication factor could be something you have, such as a possession factor, or in other words, something you could lose, like a smart card, an authenticator app, or a security token. Like if you have an authenticator app on your phone, that would be an example of a possession factor. And finally, it would be something you are, or an inherence factor. This is something inherent to you. It would have to be like physically cut off of you, from you, for it to not exist, no longer exist. So fingerprints, facial scans, retina iris scans. And so multi-factor authentication is the process of requiring two or more of these authentication factors. Now, the important point here is that MFA means you are combining two or more of these factors. You're not staying within an individual factor. So requiring a password and the answer to a security question would not technically qualify as MFA because you're not branching outside of that individual authentication factor. But if you were to require a password and an authenticator code from an authenticator app, that would qualify as multi-factor authentication. And so we need to make sure that we are branching outside of one individual authentication factor. If we are only relying on one of these, we are significantly increasing the chance of an adversary successfully gaining a hold of that system. So there are lots of different ways that you can fit multi-factor authentication into your cybersecurity program. And we recommend that you just think MFA by default, honestly. I mean, that's just the direction, it's the place we're in as a whole right now, honestly. Think MFA by default and enable multi-factor authentication on, I say all accounts accessing sensitive information. You could go beyond that. I mean, that's the bare minimum. I would encourage you to go beyond that and say, use MFA everywhere you possibly can, because you don't know what avenue an adversary may try to take as they look for the information that they're after. And so this applies to applications, it applies to databases, applies to networks. Yes, it even applies to like your social media. If you are not using multi-factor authentication for your social media, go do that, please. But especially for business-related processes and anything having to do with your corporate network, user accounts on that network, all of these should have multi-factor authentication enabled on them. Additionally, as you look to add more technology to your environment, be sure to avoid those that do not have an MFA capability. It is surprising how many do not, but I think they're quickly realizing that in order to stay competitive in the market, they need to offer multi-factor authentication, because again, it's just the direction that we are heading in if we're not already there. So be on the lookout and enable MFA. I'm going to say everywhere. MFA by default. That's going to be our mantra. If your organization does provide a VPN where you allow your users to work remotely, ensure that there is multi-factor authentication enabled on that VPN. There are other, as we sort of alluded to last week, there are other safeguards, there are other steps that you'll need to put in place to ensure remote work is safe. But one of the things you can do is to require MFA on your VPN so that an adversary cannot get a hold of that remote connection and sneak their way in. Additionally, and I was not originally planning on talking about this, but my colleague Adam had a fun experience with this very recently, and so I put this in here. Be sure to coach your users on selecting quality multi-factor authentication applications. So when you go to, if you have an iPhone, if you go to the App Store, if you have an Android or whatever the App Store equivalent would be, ensure that your users know which multi-factor authentication applications are legit, and train them to beware of fake, false, predatory MFA apps out there, because they do exist. In Adam's case, he was helping a user get set up with Microsoft Authenticator, which on the screen here would be the one on the bottom. But this Authenticator on the top, it's made to look exactly like Microsoft Authenticator, or very, very similar. And so a user who is not familiar with MFA, maybe is just getting started, they may search for MS Authenticator and download the wrong app. Now, I'm not saying that this one specifically is indeed malicious or predatory, but these apps are out there. And I believe it was, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was this one that actually asked the user to provide like sensitive information that have nothing to do with MFA. A true MFA app is just going to ask you to scan a QR code and then it will update on your phone, and then that's it. You're off and running. It's not going to ask for any sensitive information. So ensure that you are training your users to utilize MFA apps that are legit, that are trustworthy. And again, I wasn't expecting to talk about that, but this is a very recent issue that we actually had to deal with. And so it's a learning experience for us. Like, we are seeing how creative adversaries are getting to take advantage of us. And so this is a new risk I'd encourage you to be aware of and to train your users on. Well, we have reached the end of our session for today. Please type any questions that you have in the chat. I'd be happy to answer those as we wrap this guy up for today. But we've talked about a lot. We've talked about some beginning steps to backing up your information, to establishing an incident response plan, identifying your recovery metrics, and what sorts of things you can do to protect yourself from an unplanned event, from unexpected data loss right away. We also looked briefly at multi-factor authentication being an incredibly powerful technology to protect us from credential attacks, from our users using bad passwords. If a user has a poor password, if they have multi-factor authentication enabled, it's not as big a deal. In fact, a lot of security engineers out there say that if you don't have MFA, or excuse me, if you have MFA, the password really doesn't matter. I don't know if I go so far as to say that, but again, that statistic using MFA is going to drastically increase your ability to prevent an attack from being successful. And so I don't see any questions, but I would encourage you again to join us next week as we wrap up our series. We will discuss our final control, collect and analyze event logs, and then we will look at an overview of everything that we have discussed during the series and provide you with some next steps for getting your cybersecurity program off the ground and where to go from here. Any questions? Okay. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.